thanks to Gilad Sharvit and Gilad Shenhav for the kind invitation to join this conference and for their fabulous organization. And also, I want to thank the Bucerius Institute for making it possible. Luther's virulent and catastrophically influential anti-Semitism makes him a poor fit with Levinas, Derrida, Benjamin, Yankelevich, Amiri, Scholem, and Arendt. But the significance of Luther and his approach to the Bible is crucial for much of the German Jewish thought being discussed at this conference, as Cedric intimated yesterday. German Jewish intellectuals of the 20th century had an ingrained reception of Luther, also by way of Kant's pietism, Hegel's philosophy of religion, Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, Weber's sociology, Rudolf Bultmann's theology, and Marburg, Schmidt's political theology, and so on. It is even emblematic of Luther's covert significance for our conference that the artist Rebecca Kateman recently made a discovery about Benjamin's famous Angelus Novus drawing by Paul Klee. She found that Klee had mounted the Angelus Novus on top of a portrait of Martin Luther from 1838. This is an artwork by Kateman. This is not, because it's underneath, you don't see the Martin Luther portrait. So this is her art. The 19th century portrait was itself a copy of a 16th century portrait by Lucas Cranach the Elder. But my paper today is not going to talk about Benjamin. Instead, as indicated in my title, I want to talk about Luther, in particular connection with Erich Auerbach, and the significance of realism, both for Luther in his praise of Moses as a writer, and for Auerbach in the wake of Luther, namely regarding debates about whether Auerbach's approach is best understood as Protestant or Jewish. Erich Auerbach was a premier German Jewish philologist and scholar of Romance literature until he fled Nazi Germany for Turkey and eventually the USA. His monumental monograph, published in 1946, Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature, contains a well-known opening chapter that compares the style of Genesis 22 and the Akedah to that of the Odyssey's Book 19, in which the old nurse Euroclea recognizes Odysseus by his scar. This is obviously an English copy. Auerbach argues that the Hebrew scriptures' terse style, fraught with background which leaves so much unsaid, reflects a different style of representation of reality, a different kind of realism than the fully externalized, all-foreground, detail-packed style of Homeric epic. I'd like to investigate today how Auerbach's understanding of biblical realism may be seen in light of Luther's own appreciation for realism in the Hebrew Bible. Thus, I will first focus on Luther as an inadvertent literary critic and on his presumably unintentionally aesthetic defenses of Moses as lawgiver and as author of the Hebrew Bible. To be clear, the issues around claims for Mosaic authorship and what that means, whether Moses' authorship was a matter of divine inspiration, dictation, repetition, composition, or revision, all of those are highly contested and they're not in my expertise, although I imagine somebody here might be able to say more about them. For the purposes of today, I'm interested in how Luther specifically praises Moses as an author, and in particular in one aesthetically sensitive moment of his preface, that's Luther's preface, that I will show also pertains directly to Auerbach and the question of realism. And what I want to argue is that, well, of course, Luther is crucial to the notion of literal and figural biblical reading. Luther is also a proleptic thinker of literary realism. In other words, I argue that what might anachronistically be called realist aesthetics are already at issue in Luther's discussion of the Old Testament, and I'm sticking with Luther's terminology with that. This is not entirely surprising insofar as Luther famously rejects the Roman Catholic Church's emphasis on allegorical readings and claims that his own reading of Scripture is entirely literal. Thus, for instance, Luther preaches that the Psalms are literally, not metaphorically or allegorically, about Christ. I will propose that the intersections of literal reading, historical reading, and what we call realism appear in ways in Luther that also play out in Auerbach. But also, those same intersections, I will argue, are perceived by Luther himself, both latently and patently, in his praise of Moses and the Hebrew Bible. Given the context of Auerbach's life and career until his flight from National Socialism, he certainly stands within a Protestant tradition. But regarding the question of whether Auerbach's approach is Jewish or Protestant, I'm proposing that Luther is indebted to the Hebrew Bible's own aesthetics and realist style, and thus Luther is already involved in the same Jewish realism that Auerbach explores in the Mimesis chapter. In other words, if Auerbach follows Luther in certain respects in his understanding of figura and of realism, as I'll explain, but Luther himself is deploying or dependent on implicit realist aesthetics that are not unequivocally Christian, but might also be ascribed to a Jewish provenance, then the difference between calling Auerbach's reading Protestant or Jewish is more complicated than it may appear. I am thus in agreement with Galili Shahar's declaration that it is difficult to separate the Jewish from the Christian in Auerbach's reading, but I'm applying that to the question of realism. Luther opens his preface to his translation of the Old Testament with citations from the New Testament that he takes commended as required reading by Christians. Against others in the ancient vein of Marcion, and some of Luther's own contemporaries as well, who would discard the Old Testament entirely, Luther wants to uphold its flawlessness and value. Luther's preface to the Old Testament is thus full of acclaim for Moses and the Old Testament, characterizing Moses as the perfect lawgiver. What Luther emphasizes about Moses' perfection is how he maximizes the conditions for producing crisis among Jewish believers. For Luther, obviously in the long legacy of Paul, the point of Jewish law is to evoke a crisis regarding the inability to obey the laws of faith and love and the detailed laws of ritual practice. What Luther sees as the crisis and failure of the ancient Israelites and generations of Jews to fully accept and follow the law laid out by Moses, that crisis and failure, constitutes the paradoxical proof for Luther of Moses' success, insofar as that crisis and failure, in Luther's view, in his earlier years, should cause Jews to convert to Christianity, en masse. Luther extols as heroic Moses' piling on of laws and Moses' emphatic attempts at persuasion, which are precisely intended to provoke the crisis that should produce a yearning for grace and a recognition of the ineffectiveness of law in justifying us before God. Luther's account is even amusing in hinting at the patience that Moses must have possessed, as Luther catalogs wearily how in the Old Testament Moses gives the law, expands on the law, organizes the people, increases the law, repeats the law, explains it again, and reestablishes it. Luther is a minister among sometimes reluctant audiences, as Moses is a minister to a sometimes resistant audience, and the sympathy Luther has for Moses is obvious. Directly before the passage I want to focus on, Luther explains that Moses, as perfect lawgiver, lays out different kinds of laws. There are, in Luther's classification, temporal laws, or everyday prohibitions intended to deter wicked behavior. And there are laws about how to worship, and there are the most important laws of love and faith in God, which, as Luther preaches in his sermons, are the only laws that really matter, and to which all other laws are subordinated. In this context of differentiating different types of Old Testament laws, temporal laws, laws of worship, and the law of love and faith, Luther anticipates an objection to his effusive praise of Moses. He anticipates a Christian objection, one that presumes what Luther presumes, namely that the commandments of love and faith are the only ones that matter. The anticipated objection is this: if the commandments of love and faith are the only truly important commandments to which all others are subordinated, then why does Moses jumble together all the different kinds of commandments throughout the Old Testament? Why are the supreme laws of love and faith mixed in with all these other kinds of laws about tabernacles, food, and so forth throughout the Old Testament? As Luther imagines it, and I give it here in German, I'll have some references to German that you don't have to know. As Luther imagines it, the anticipated objection is this: but why does Moses mix up his laws in such a disordered way? Why does he not put the temporal laws together in one group, and the spiritual laws in another, and the laws of faith and love in still another? Why, in other words, does Moses not lay out the classification of laws in this anticipated objection as clearly as Luther himself does? Luther's answer to this imagined objection is an answer that's worthy of Auerbach. It's an aesthetic answer, a literary answer, and it is about realism. Luther defends Moses by saying that the scripture is truer to life this way, that the composition of the Old Testament is better for mixing up the different laws, that this mixed up composition epitomizes how Moses was for Luther the perfect lawgiver, because Luther notes even our days are a jumble of events with various activities, together with the need to have love and faith in God at all different kinds of moments. Luther is praising the mix of the most important or highest laws with the less important or lower laws, even with laws that Luther elsewhere calls unnecessary laws. This will be an important bridge to Auerbach in a few minutes, insofar as Auerbach also focuses on the mix of high and low style, high and low characters and situations. That's an element crucial to Auerbachian realism, and it is precisely what Luther praises in tacitly aesthetic terms with regard to Moses. This is a long quote. The answer to this anticipated objection is that Moses writes as the situation demands, wie sich es treibt, and I'll come back to the German in a moment, or how things press on, you might say, so that his book is a picture and illustration of governing and of living, for this is the way it happens in a dynamic situation, wenn es im Schwang geht. Now this work has to be done, and now that. No man can so arrange his life, if he is to act in a godly way, it's Luther's parenthesis, that on this day he uses only spiritual laws, and on that day only temporal. Rather, God governs all the laws mixed together like the stars in the heavens and the flowers in the fields in such a way that at every hour a man must be ready for anything, to do whatever the situation requires. In like manner, the writing of Moses represents a heterogeneous mixture. It does not go against Luther's theological assumptions to say that he sees the Old Testament as composed according to principles of what Auerbach will call realism. The Old Testament jumbles up the different kinds of commandments, rather than stating or directly portraying, as Luther preaches, that love and faith are the supreme commandments, and the others are subordinate. And it does this precisely because life is a jumble, because from Luther's perspective, the Old Testament thus illustrates how it is with governing and living, and illustration has a lot of aesthetic implications. The suggestion is that part of Moses' genius as lawgiver is his attempt to write scripture in this way so that it would be realistic, true to life. Luther thus defends Moses against a imagined Christian accusation that the Old Testament was written in this counterproductively jumbled way. So Luther's ostensible reason, I'm arguing, is an aesthetic one. Moses' supposed jumble of the different kinds of laws is not praised by Luther as being persuasive in being true to everyday life. Instead, the mixed up presentation appears to be seen as aesthetically appropriate, or what we might even call poetic. Hence, Luther writes, as I've already said, the answer is that Moses writes as the situation demands. Moses schreibt, wie sich es treibt, and I'll come back to that, so that his book is a picture and illustration of governing and living. The book of Moses illustrates, again, already an aesthetic operation, governing and living as they are, as intertwined. I want to emphasize Luther's literary sensibility by pointing to two poetic and aesthetic elements produced by Luther himself. First, Luther's own formulation is rather poetic. And here I give you, it's German, but you can see the rhyme and the repetition. The rhyme, schreibt. Moses writes, wie it drives, would be the closest I can get. This schreibt produces an oral matching of the writing and the way things are in the world. There's a similar repetition, a form of rhetorical anti-metabole in the next sentence when Luther writes, dann so geht es zu, wenn es im Schwang geht, which could roughly translate to, so it happens when things are a-happening. And similarly with the repetition of jetzt, or now, jetzt, dieses Verb, jetzt jenes getan sein muss, now you have to do this work, now that work. Each of these elements show literary artfulness with rhyme, variations in order, and the repetition of words to connect two clauses. This is how Luther writes and preaches. His artful composition is apparent and his poetic acumen put to full use. Logically, Luther notes that one cannot follow one type of law on some days and another type on another day, but the logic is borne out in the poetic composition that jumbles them together. Secondly, Luther follows his justification of the jumble with an aesthetic flourish. Rather, God governs all the laws mixed together like the stars in the heavens and the flowers in the fields. Luther's references to stars and flowers, classic examples of beauty, supports my suspicion about the aesthetics here, that this is an aesthetic choice connected to nature but also to beauty and the pleasure of a well-wrought work, a governed whole made perfect and therefore beautiful. God governs or orders his laws the way he orders the stars in the sky and the flowers in the fields, scattered about with no apparent order but nonetheless beautiful results. We even perhaps here see a precursor to Kant's connection of his wonder at the stars above to his wonder at the moral law within. In the second half of my paper now, I want to focus on the relationship between realism, figural reading, and what Auerbach defines as the truth of the Hebrew Bible. Auerbach's famous comparison of Homer and the Hebrew Bible in his chapter, The Scar of Odysseus, the first chapter of Mimesis, describes the representation of reality in the story of the Akedah, and by extension, the entire Hebrew Bible. Some scholars suggest it's not a comparison merely between the Hebrew Bible and Homer, but instead, Auerbach finds the Hebrew Bible's realism more complex than Homer's. Its characters are multidimensional, nuanced, and truer to life than Homer's relatively monolithic characters. And very important for Auerbach, the Hebrew Bible mixes the styles of high and low, as I indicated. The mix of high and low is part of what Auerbach sees as the aspect of Hebrew Bible that constitutes its continuity with later literary representations of reality. Homer's tales focus on heroes and gods. The Hebrew Bible includes characters from all stations of life and even episodes in which patriarchs may appear foolish or ill-intentioned. The very language, as Robert Alter describes extensively, exhibits a range of registers. The issue of mixing high and low again provides that bridge from Luther to Auerbach. The jumbling of laws in Luther's rendition of the Old Testament and Luther's appreciation for the mix of laws as a point of realism acknowledges the mix of high and low at the level of biblical style that's central to Auerbach. But apart from that emphasis on high and low, Auerbach argues that in the Hebrew Bible there's a further difference from the Odyssey, namely that the Hebrew Bible claims for itself to be truth in a way that Homer's Odyssey does not. The Odyssey, according to Auerbach, doesn't demand belief. It operates just as well as legend and entertainment. The poet may even be a liar, as according to Plato. The Hebrew Bible, in contrast, according to Auerbach, is autocratic and tyrannical. It imposes itself as the truth, not as legend, not as entertainment. This is a different kind of realism than Homer's because it is a realism connected to truth. The Hebrew Bible, Auerbach explains, claims for itself a truth as a universal, true history into which we all fit. I'll just skip reading it, you can read yourselves. We are a part of that history rather than it being an object for us. This may be seen as one indication as well of Auerbach's Hegelianism. The claim to the truth of the Hebrew Bible as described in Mimesis and its relationship to the New Testament are historicized in Auerbach's long essay Figura, published in the Archivum Romanicum in 1938. Figura traces the historical senses of figural reading in Western literature, with the focus on typological, prefigural, prophetic, and allegorical readings that in early Christianity and the Middle Ages accounted for the connection between the Old and New Testaments. There are numerous variations and ambiguities in Auerbach's conceptual history or Begriffsgeschichte of Figura, revolving around what figure and fulfillment are taken to mean. Do they mean that real historical events recorded in the Old Testament presage true and real events of the New Testament? Or does Figura mean that the Old Testament stories metaphorically foretell the real New Testament events? Or does Figura mean that the events of the New Testament fulfill the Old Testament insofar as the Old Testament is interpreted as phenomenal prophecy rather than as historical truth? Do the stories of the Old Testament provide a carnal, material presentation of what is spiritually promised in the New Testament? Or does Figura mean that the New Testament itself occupies a middle position, fulfilling the Old Testament's prophecy, while in its own turn further prophesying the Last Judgment? This range of possibilities for understanding Figura informs a further range of Christian views about the value and truth of the Old Testament. Thus, in Mimesis, Auerbach describes the role that figural reading plays in very early missionizing among the Gentiles, specifically in adapting the Old Testament to the missionizing purpose. These are his claims here. Perhaps Daniel will say something else. The Old Testament, he writes, was played down as popular history and as the code of the Jewish people, and assumed the appearance of a series of figures, that is, of prophetic announcements and anticipations of the coming of Jesus and the concomitant events. So in this context, the sensory and material elements of the Old Testament are repurposed to mean something from the New Testament figuratively, such that, second quote here, all one's interest is directed toward the context of meaning. Thus, among the early church fathers, third quote, we almost always find an interpretation of the Old Testament whose episodes are interpreted as figures or phenomenal prophecies of the events of the New Testament. Again, by phenomenal prophecy, Auerbach is referring to the presumption of the historical truth of the events of the Old Testament, which in their reality serve also as a prophecy of the coming of Christ and the real events of the New Testament. In this version, the Old Testament events truly happened. It's not just a story that prophesies the New Testament in an allegorical or metaphorical way. In the Figura essay, Auerbach emphasizes how Figura works for Tertullian in this fashion, that the Old Testament is a real and historical event that figures another set of real and historical events. Our understanding recognizes the figure, but the figure and the fulfillment are equally real and historical. This figural realism of Tertullian, Jerome, and Augustine stands in contrast to a symbolic and allegorical notion of figuration in which one or both components are not taken to be real. Figura is opposed to allegory because, I quote, an event is taken as a figure. An event taken as a figure, and not as an allegory, preserves its literal and historical meaning. It remains an event, does not become a mere sign. End of quote. We may think of figures in terms of signs, but Auerbach is highlighting how one object or event may figure another without becoming a mere sign. It remains what it is, and yet points to the other object or event of which it is a figure in its reality, not as an allegory, symbol, or metaphor. Auerbach refers to his book on Dante in this regard, which describes in terms of figuralism the Dante characters as having both earthly and otherworldly appearances, such that the former is the figure, the earthly appearance, and the latter is the fulfillment, the otherworldly appearance. In this, however, this is, I skipped that, I'm skipping that. In this case, the Auerbach is referring to Dante. A figural schema permits both its poles, the figure and its fulfillment, to retain the characteristics of a concrete historical reality. According to James Porter, Auerbach's account of figura reflects the conflicted character of figura from the start. Is its truth at all allegorical, or is it fully this worldly? Auerbach attempts to provide a clear taxonomy, but the lines become blurry. Figura in Auerbach's Begriffsgeschichte, or conceptual history, is so elastic in its valences that despite itself, allegorical, real, symbolic, typological, prophetic, and literal all do make appearances. Porter writes that figura doesn't know whether it wants to locate its reality in history or outside of history in a spiritual beyond. But why is figura so multivalent? This conflicted nature of figura is the result precisely of that fraught and shadowy background of the Hebrew scripture. Doctrine and promise, Auerbach writes, are incarnate in the stories of the Hebrew Bible and inseparable from them. For that very reason, they are fraught with background and mysterious, containing a second concealed meaning. The stories require subtle investigation and interpretation. They demand them. Since so much in the story is dark and incomplete, and since the reader knows that God is a hidden God, his effort to interpret it constantly finds something new to feed upon. Doctrine and the search for enlightenment are inextricably connected with the physical side of the narrative. So the fraught background style and its withholding of so much detail and so much context founds the tension that appears in figura between being allegorical and being concrete and effectual as is. That is, the intensity of the sensual in the Hebrew scripture, combined with its unplumbed recesses that demand plumbing and interpreting. These make for the figural tradition of Christianity. To say it more strongly, the tension in figura is already there in the Hebrew Bible. If we want to be provocative, we could call it a Jewish tension. It's not something invented by the Christian tradition and imposed onto Hebrew scripture. Rather, precisely the fraught background of the Hebrew Bible that Auerbach emphasizes in Mimesis evokes the indeterminacy of the stories as allegories, histories, and figures that come to appear in the Christian tradition. I'm leaning heavily on James Porter's reading here in pointing out that the span of allegory, typology, literal reading, prophetic reading, etc., is the issue of figura. All the ambiguity around whether figura is the same as or compatible with or different from metaphorical or allegorical readings, all of these ambiguities are already present in the text of the Hebrew Bible that give rise to figura to begin with. This is what I suggest is the common root of the conflicting claims that Auerbach is a Protestant hermeneut, or on the other hand, a Jewish philologist. My point would be that it is not a Christian or Protestant issue. It's already the case that the Hebrew scripture is readable in the elastic terms of figura, even without reference to the New Testament. And the Hebrew scripture is so readable in elastic terms of figura precisely insofar as it is, as Auerbach writes about, fraught with background. The Hebrew Bible's events, characters, and situations are realistic, and they beg for interpretation because, and here I use Heideggerian language, they withhold as well as disclose. The narrative of the Akedah that's at the center of the Mimesis chapter is so sparse, so withholding, that it allows for and beckons toward the disclosure of a larger meaning. Let me close by going beyond Porter's point about the fraught background of the Hebrew Bible as the source of Christian figural reading, in order to argue briefly, as I close here, in a more existential phenomenological vein, that the fraught and figura-prone realism that Auerbach finds in the Hebrew scripture is also the fraught and interpretation-demanding, ambiguous reality of our lives. In our real lives, crucial elements appear to us, while other elements recede, but in other lights, or in view of future events, our reality can be interpreted differently, as a portent, for instance, as a completion, as a repetition. Are these also forms of figura? Actual life is fraught with background. Actual life lends itself to hermeneutics, to understandings that may be figural, prophetic, conspiratorial, existential, or nihilistic. Reality is not as it is in Homer, not all illuminated at once to us in our finitude. As Luther acknowledges Moses for his realist mix of laws that illustrates everyday life, I'm acknowledging Auerbach's realist account of how people, events, and situations inherently lend themselves to figural interpretation because there's always a fraught background, always more that remains undisclosed. Staying with the Heideggerian terminology, in reality, disclosure and concealment are wrapped up with one another. Elements stand out, elements recede, there are nuances and gaps, and thus reality is infinitely subject to and even only livable under the conditions of interpretation. No wonder then that the realism of the Hebrew scripture is one with its hermeneutic appeal, with the possibility of rendering it a figure of the New Testament, for our real living in the world is likewise a matter of fraught background and hermeneutic beckoning. Thank you.